Welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinar series. This is our October session. Today's session is from Alistair, Paul and Abby. They are talking about accessible e-assessment, so assessment for all from rhetoric to realities. So could our first speaker probably, Alistair, is it?
It is indeed. Good morning everybody, and just to clarify the outline of the session, there's three of us speaking. I'm going to be introducing key facets of accessible assessment, so we're going to put it in a highly practical context, what we actually mean by accessible assessment. Then Paul is going to have a look at the awarding bodies in the UK background, and particularly with a focus on Scotland, where accessible assessment has been very much on the radar for the main awarding bodies since 2008. And then Abby's going to come in at the end looking at caveats and counting, looking at some of the issues, some of the things we need to be aware of even when we're doing accessible assessments. And the counting bit's particularly important because it's the whole area of maths, science, symbols, numbers, etc., and the impact of that on accessibility and some of the issues concerned with that. So, without further ado, I want to look at a number of key facets of accessible assessment. And the first one I want to look at is the accessibility of the language. This is an obvious one. It's not particularly related to disabled people. The text chat has got a URL in it which takes you to a really nice document, Fair Access by Design, and there's a particular section, section 26, with some nice examples on readability. I don't suggest you look at it at the moment, but it may be worth just opening in the browser so that it's there for later reference and you can bookmark it. But the key thing about the clarity of language is that unnecessarily complex language can create unnecessary barriers because it fails to allow the candidate to demonstrate their knowledge of the subject. And it's really important candidates are not penalised by the inability of question setters to communicate clearly and unambiguously. So that's the first facet that we want to explore. The second facet, going too fast for my own good, is media. Now, there is a very strong sense in which the media can present real benefits for learners, but as it presents a benefit for some kinds of learners, it can create barriers for others. So images and video, for example, can provide really user-friendly media for deaf and dyslexic students, but they may present real barriers to blind learners. Audio resources embedded in an interactive e-assessment may be fantastic for dyslexic users and blind users, but present a barrier for deaf users. Now, generally speaking, text is the most universally accessible medium, but the trouble is that a text-only assessment can add significant barriers for people with print impairment. So there is a real balancing act to do. And I think the key thing is to recognize that rich media can add lots of value for lots of learners, and to make sure that when you add that value, you also add appropriate alternative descriptions or indeed alternative tasks so that people with sensory impairments can still participate effectively. Third facet, what is the nature of the task? What are we asking people to do? Now, e-assessments do give people the opportunity to engage in a really big variety of tasks. Now, at the simplest level, it may involve writing on the screen, but it could equally involve selecting options from a drop-down box or dragging and dropping items to targets. Now, again, these activities can add lots of benefits for lots of learners, but they do need to be tested for accessibility. Particularly if somebody cannot see the screen or cannot use a mouse. So drag and drop can be a brilliant way of enabling people to complete mix and match sort of tasks without having to type things in and lose marks because of their spelling. But at the same time, if you've got somebody who can't use a mouse, will your drag and drop work with a keyboard-only alternative? So those are the sorts of things where testing is really significant and important. The format is equally important because different formats have native accessibility profiles. The least accessible PDF, for example, would be a scanned image of text. and that's accessible to nobody in any particular way, apart from the fact you can magnify it a little bit. But PDFs with selectable text, so if you've got a PDF with actual selectable text in there, you can reach a high degree of accessibility, and Paul will talk about that later. E-assessments created in Flash tend to have significant accessibility barriers unless they've been deliberately designed to be accessible. And obviously, formats like HTML and EPUB3 are inherently more accessible, but by poor design, it's perfectly possible to make a really accessible format very difficult for people to use. So there are these range of things. The format won't guarantee accessibility, but it can, to some extent, guarantee barriers, depending on which formats you choose. Support for the learner is something that becomes an issue when you're talking about big scale, maybe regional or national tests, because how the learner is supported can make a big difference to how well they can cope. So if you're face-to-face in a physical assessment centre, for example, I'm in a college, I'm in a room, I've got IT people nearby on call, then that can make things a lot easier. If I have a technical problem. There can also be another kind of support for the learner, which is like interpretive support. So if I've got a sensory impairment, say I'm blind, for example, I've got a diagram which isn't accessible, somebody describes it to me. So those sorts of supports can make a big difference to whether or not the assessment you're looking at becomes more accessible, becomes less accessible. And obviously, if you've got something that's taking place nationally or regionally, that support may simply not be available, and that needs to be factored into, into how you describe the accessibility of your assessments. There is the nature of the test. Now, again, the appropriate level of accessibility, or maybe the level of inaccessibility you could get away with, will depend on the nature of the test. So if it's a career-defining summative test, it's really got to be as accessible to as many people as possible. But a small-scale test used in a faculty of a university or in a subject area in a college, you can probably get away with a lot more quick and dirty accessibility because there's human support that can be provided to reduce the barriers. And it may be human support that is not scalable. Obviously, for a whole organization, for a state, or for a national assessment, it's imperative that accessibility is built in from the bottom. But there's also another factor, which is the longevity of a test. If I've got a test that I'm going to sit with my students just this year, just my students, my college, and I don't have any blind students and I don't have any deaf students, I can probably do what I like because it's only going to last a year. If I've got a test that I'm going to be using for the next 5 years for my, a whole cluster of colleges or universities, that's very different. And then the accessibility approach. What I'm talking about here is how awarding bodies and professionals with responsibility for creating assessments can have a range of approaches, and they have different risks associated with them. There are still some areas where there's blissful ignorance and people are so excited by a cool interactivity that they can do on the screen that they haven't realized that some of the learners can't use their cool interactivity. There's what I describe as anxiously ignorant, where that probably applies to more organizations where people are aware there's a problem, but they're not necessarily clear on how to address it. Many organizations are taking accessibility seriously, and all of them need to, because in most of our countries it's a legal imperative. But I would describe there as being two broad approaches. One is a kind of foraging approach where people there isn't necessarily an embedded overall kind of clarity in where the accessibility is going. So they find something or maybe test this exam paper, hey, that works, that's really good. And they'll come up with a way of doing some interactivity on screen, and lo and behold, it works really well with a screen reader. And that can sometimes be a bit serendipitous. People try things and some of them work and some of them don't. But the other approach, the forager approach, is kind of see what you can do and see what works. That's okay. I mean, I wouldn't knock it because it's better than not doing anything. But the alternative is what I call the farmer approach, where you don't just go around looking for accessibility, you actually embed it, grow it, and nurture it to fruition, where you start off from the beginning thinking, you know, how am I going to create an accessible assessment that will be up to the scrutiny of being tested with disabled learners, and testing is built into part of my quality life cycle for the assessments. And that's something that really bears fruit in the end. That's the farming approach. Now, what I want to do very quickly is, let's just have a look at the next slide, because I want to get you people doing something. These are the easy realities. These are the things that generally, with just a little bit of planning, you can do. Now, I think we have do we have the whiteboard working? Yes, we have the whiteboard tool on the right, and there's a pencil there, the third one down. And if you can see that, let me just make a mark up. Yeah, up at the top. Yeah, I've made a little yellow mark up the top. What I'd like you to do is to use that tool to tick anything on that screen. You can see any of those easy realities that you actually don't think the assessments that you're using can do. Okay, don't tick the things they can do, because if they can do them, that's fine. We don't need to worry about those. But what I want to do is just get a sense from the people that are on here with us. What are the challenges? So can you tick any of those that you think may or may not be true for the assessments that you're used to using? So using without a mouse, that's a classic one. Very often you have these great little interactivities, but only great if you're a competent mouse user. The navigation's an interesting one, being able to navigate quickly through topics and not have to go sort of piece by piece through one at a time. So it's very much the ones down the bottom. That's interesting, yes. There's a little comment there. I can't see all of it. Yes, but not W is what I can see. But okay. And the critical thing with all of this is to be able to work with your learners directly and to get the feedback from them. Right, thank you very much for that. That's fairly much as I would have expected, but interesting that some people are working with assessments where even some of the really basic stuff, like can I change colours, is not necessarily guaranteed. I won't go into this in any detail here, but just to be aware that those are the easy realities, the technical realities. There are other harder realities, like competencies. You know, in electrical engineering, is it right for me to label the colours on the wires because a colourblind person can't see it? Or would I indeed expect being able to tell a red wire from a green wire to be a basic competency of somebody going into electrical engineering? So there are those kinds of questions. There's equivalencies. If people can write an essay or record an audio or record a video, how do you get an equivalence between, for marking? There's the balance. The paper that's brilliant for dyslexic people and deaf people may be really not brilliant for blind people. And the critical thing that I've kind of marked down the bottom here is the importance of, when you make those difficult decisions, make sure there's a written justification somewhere. And the last thing for you to be aware of, if you're involved in creating tests or procuring test systems, be aware of EduPub. I won't go into any of the details now, but what I will just say is that EduPub is in many ways the future. It's taking IMS global standards, things that govern being able to set activities, get feedback, get reflection, have repositories. It's pulling all those different things on this slide, all those different elements with their different standards, different interoperabilities. EduPub is an international program to bring all of those together with EPUB 3 and IMS global standards, and accessibility is at the core of that. Get EduPub and you begin to solve some of the future issues. And that's now over to Paul. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm hoping that you can hear me. And so I'm going to be talking about the awarding bodies in the UK experience, and particularly with regard to our experiences in Scotland. Now then, I've just realised I don't know how to move the slide on to the next
I saw there were small buttons up in the top right-hand corner, the two arrow buttons there.
Got you. Okay. So I'm going to concentrate on the digital papers in Scotland. In Scotland, we have a separate examination system to the rest of the UK, and a separate education system, in fact, and a separate curriculum. And the examination system at the end of the school system is a traditional one. It involves mainly bits of paper that the candidates have got to read, and then other bits of paper and where they've got to write. Now, in line with most other countries, if you've got candidates who've got some kind of difficulty with reading the paper or writing, generating the responses, then you can use assessment arrangements. In other parts of the UK, they're called access arrangements. And they can be many and varied. So if you have a difficulty reading the paper, you could have a human reader to read the questions to you. Or you could be using a scribe, or you could be using ICT, or you could get papers in alternative formats such as Braille or large print, or printed in a different font, or printed on a different colour. About a decade ago, I got asked to have a look at the whole question of using technology in examinations. And we did some trials, and then following the trials, which were successful, digital question papers were introduced as an assessment arrangement in 2008. Now, the format we used for the papers is just PDF, so there's nothing fancy about this. The PDFs are exact copies, digital copies of the paper, so they're identical to what the candidates would use if they were doing it on paper. The text is readable, so you can have it read out with text-to-speech. They have on-screen drawing tools, but that's just the basic tools that are built into Adobe Reader. But it does mean that some candidates, if they've got a difficulty with marking or scribing on a paper, then you could use the digital method instead. So in this example, you've just got to draw some lines to match up the terms. We've got answer boxes added where the questions are question and answer papers, and that just means that you can click and type your answer instead of handwriting your answer on the paper. And they've also got these tick box items down here, which means that if you're using the digital paper, you can interact with it on the computer. Just a couple of URLs that might be useful for you. Our organisation is Call Scotland, and if you wanted to find a little bit more about the digital papers, we have a separate website here where you can have a look at the papers and some of the reports that we've done in the past. And so why PDF? Because PDF, of course, has got a relatively unlovely reputation for being not terribly accessible. But the reason why we chose it a decade ago was, first of all, it's accessible for the majority of candidates who require assessment arrangements. And of course, the majority of candidates who require some kind of assistance in an exam are those who are dyslexic or have got some reading or writing difficulty. They're not particularly accessible for blind users who require a screen reader, but that's a relatively small number of, in fact, a very, very small number of candidates who have got a difficulty with the exam paper. And so we took the decision that PDF would be a good format, and that we would make different arrangements for candidates who use screen readers. Second reason is it's free to access for schools and learners because you just need Adobe Reader. It's also very inexpensive for SQA to produce because they already generate PDFs of their papers when it's as part of the printing process. PDF, of course, is reasonably reliable as far as these things can be when we're talking about technology. And it was a pragmatic solution to the problem. There were many other different formats we could use, but for example, HTML wasn't an option because at that time you couldn't rely on internet connections in schools in Scotland. So PDF and Word would have been another format, but that would involve essentially re-desktop publishing the entire set of papers, which wasn't really a pragmatic thing for SQA to consider. And also, there's some simple things about Word which are mean that you don't want the possibility of the candidate inadvertently or deliberately deleting the question. And when you use the form field option in Word, then it knocks out some of the screen reading tools. So PDF worked quite well. It also means that you can use free text-to-speech programs. And one of the things that we found in the early days in the trials was that the voices that were provided with some of the free tools were not terribly great. And so one of the things that we did was I got money from the Scottish Government to license 2 high-quality free Scottish voices, and these are available from this website here, provided you're a public sector or a school organisation in Scotland. Of course, they're not licensed for use elsewhere. So they do have some limitations, being PDFs. The first one, and the one that attracts most criticism, is that not all the papers are question and answer format with answer boxes on the screen. We only have this answer boxes where the original paper was in that format, and so for some of the papers you would be answering the questions in a separate answer booklet, and so if you're doing it digitally, you have to do the same thing, either using a word processor or a digital version of the answer booklet, either in Word or PDF. Some of the questions, as Alistair indicated earlier on, some of the questions are simply not designed for use on screen, because the original papers and the questions were designed for paper. And so math and science in particular can be problematic, because if you're trying to type your answers, we are basically talking about rich text field answer boxes, which don't work fantastically well for equations or algebraic expressions. And the papers are not well suited for blind users with screen readers. You can use them, but the reading order is not defined and checked, and so they're not ideal. And so for blind users with screen readers, SQA would create a bespoke paper where the reading order was actually correct and guaranteed. So they were introduced in 2008, and in the first year there were 500 odd exams where they were used, and by 2014 that had gone up to over 4,000. Number of centres has gone up from 46 to 191. The number of candidates using the digital papers has gone from 204 in the first year to 1,400 last year. So there's no doubt that the digital papers have clearly met a need for many candidates. And I think certainly over half the schools in Scotland used them last year. And as a percentage of the assessment arrangements requests, digital question papers are becoming more and more popular. Now, one of the reasons why they've been so popular is that in Scotland, when you are having your exam read to you, or if you're using a scribe, you have a separate room and a separate member of staff to do the reading or the scribing, and a separate invigilator. So that's extremely expensive. Whereas by using the digital option, you can have, say, 10 students in the same room using headphones, one member of staff to support, and one invigilator. And so that means that schools find them much easier to administer, because you need fewer rooms and you need fewer members of staff. And also, if we're thinking of the overall cost of providing this kind of personal support, then the digital option is essentially much cheaper. Now, it doesn't necessarily cost the schools money, although it does cost some, because they sometimes buy in readers and scribes. But it does, the opportunity cost here is, I think, quite significant, because rather than having thousands of individuals having their exam read to them and having their answers written down, we could be probably doing something more productive with all these publicly paid members of staff. The reason why the figures have gone down, excuse me, in the past year is that the examination system changed in Scotland, and we now have fewer formal exams than we did the previous year. So the exam boards in the rest of the UK have been looking at the situation, I guess, and I understand coming under some pressure from organisations such as RNIB, Royal National Institute for the Blind, and the British Dyslexia Association. And so, following our experience, some of the rest of the exam boards started offering these PDF papers from 2013. The format was not necessarily as well defined as it could have been. Over the past decade or so, the Scottish Qualifications Authority has been gradually refining and improving the accessibility of the papers in response to comments and feedback from schools. And so it was felt that what would be helpful would be some kind of minimum standards. And so the UK Association for Accessible Formats has issued a consultation document covering the use of accessible PDFs for exams. And essentially this has got two different types of examination. Level 1 is basically what SQA have been using for the past 6 years. And that's a PDF version of the standard examination paper, and it's intended for use by sighted candidates. So that might be those who are dyslexic or have got reading difficulties on the autistic spectrum, dyspraxia, mild visual impairment, physical disability, learning difficulties. Level 2 is the format that's intended to be used by candidates who are blind or who've got significant visual impairment. And this is one where the language would be modified, we would have text descriptions of images, and it would be designed specifically for the needs of someone who can't actually see the paper. So, if I could move on, I think. Yep. That's me, 1 minute 50 to go, so we're on to Abby.
Good morning, I hope everybody can hear me. I'm going to be talking about the rest of the UK, or our UK as we were branded a few weeks ago, and I'm going to be talking about the work that's being done through the British Dyslexia Association and other stakeholders in the disability community, and also some of the work we do as part of the accessibility group at the University of Southampton to improve accessibility and assistive technology. So I have the lovely title Caveats and Counting, and I have a picture of a chicken and egg on the screen. And that's here to represent the situation we often find ourselves when we're trying to develop accessible systems within learning, and particularly when we're trying to retrospectively implement accessibility. Without the demand for accessible content, creators are often unwilling to put in the resources to make sure that it suits the needs of all learners. But without the knowledge that reliable, accessible content can be created, then there isn't the demand from the candidates and from their stakeholders, teachers, etc. So as Paul mentioned, since 2013, PDF versions of exam papers have been available for GCSEs and A-levels, which are our high-stake exams within the education, pre-higher education system. And what happened when PDFs became available was there hadn't been any considerations for accessibility. So over the next couple of slides, I'm going to go through the process we've been engaging in with the awarding bodies and awarding the qualification system within the rest of the UK to try and improve accessibility, and talk a bit about the process, the journey we are on. So first of all, making it a reality and working with the learning community. In a way, we're lucky in that to ensure that exam boards and qualification bodies meet their obligations under our Equality Act. The exam regulators regularly consult with representatives of the disability and special educational needs community. Paul's been talking of the perspective of Scotland, where SQA is the regulator. In England and Wales and Northern Ireland, there are also separate regulators as well. But this provides us with a forum to discuss these types of issues, and in particular, the first point on the slide of embracing the political and legislative framework. Through that, we're able to put political pressure and lobbying to ensure that accessibility needs are considered within the regulatory framework. But it's also a forum where we can bring a bottom-up approach and encourage sharing of best practice. And it's only when we've been able to demonstrate the demand for accessibility and the advantages it brings and the difference it can make in outcomes to the candidates, and also the cost effectiveness of it, as Paul demonstrated, that we can actually get everybody to consider accessibility. And however difficult it is, it's also important to highlight failures within the process when candidates haven't been able to access their exams despite the accessibility arrangements saying they can use assistive technology such as text-to-speech. One of the key factors in ensuring that technology can be used throughout learning practices with teachers and candidates is building confidence, and in particularly in a high stakes exam situation where you can't just stop and start at any point, you can't come back, it has to start on a specified time on a specified date. So it's been particularly important to build confidence within schools and teachers that the technology is going to work, the paper will be accessible, the candidate will be able to read the text back. And that's been particularly important because since 2013, candidates taking the English GCSE paper, which is the sort of minimum standard for literacy within the UK education system, are allowed to use text-to-speech, a computer reader, to support that exam where they weren't allowed to use a human reader before. So that was particularly important for candidates with dyslexia or vision impairments with reading difficulties. And finally, it's been about gaining momentum. Legislation only gets you so far. Reasonable adjustments, as it's termed within the UK, have to be balanced against the demands and the requirements. So we're in a process of gaining momentum, and as one of Paul's slides showed, they've been able to gain this momentum over the last few years in Scotland. We've started to see a big increase in the use of text-to-speech and computer readers within the UK education system as we've been talking publicly and promoting best practice. But also one of the key parts of it has been engaging with the exam boards, essentially those who are writing the assessments and publishing those. And this slide is about talking about those particular issues we've had to address with them. The first one was accessibility skills. When they first published PDFs, so they could have PDFs, send them to schools in 2013, nobody had done any considerations of accessibility. And before that, actually, they were requiring the schools to open the exam package and scan it in the hour before the exam, which brings, again, many accessibility issues. We found that it was an unknown area within their print-focused desktop publishing community. They produced PDFs for printing. They didn't have the skills or knowledge of what that meant within an e-assessment environment. We also had limited access to those staff within exam boards, and over the past year we've been trying to bring those exam boards together with experts within the accessibility community and consultants and those who've had experience within e-accessibility, and that's an ongoing journey. We also have the issue of technology creep, and particularly accessible technology creep. I saw somebody put a chat message up earlier saying, well, isn't PDF quite accessible now? One of the problems we found was that the exam boards were often using older desktop publishing tools. They hadn't kept their versions up to date, which meant they didn't have access to all the latest options and technology for ensuring that their PDFs were accessible. The third point is particularly important in terms of the regulators and in terms of the government and political infrastructure around our exam centre system, which is managing risk. Any access arrangements and modifications are always balanced against the risk to the assessment objectives and any potential malpractice. So where it's come to accessibility, it's been about how much information is text-to-speech providing to the candidate. Does that provide a fair adjustment, or are they being given too much information? And then finally, it comes down to managing costs. Particularly in England, we have 3 exam boards within the GCSE and A-level arena who are sort of in competition with each other. Some are profit-making, some are not for profit. We have the Welsh board, Northern Ireland and Scotland as well. And any accessibility and modifications are always balanced against the cost of implementation. And we found across any organisation where we're looking at accessibility, whether it's a university or a business or a public body, that it's always much easier if you have senior management or board buy-in. Often when you're talking about accessibility issues, we're talking to people who aren't part of the decision-making process. So that's critical to try and get that senior management buy-in as well. So one of the questions I wanted to just pose for you to think about today after today's session, I'm just going to post it into the text pane, is are there any other factors or barriers you've encountered or anticipate within your organisation? I realise many of you will be working within higher education where you're creating your own accessibility assessments, but maybe this will strike a chord with you as well. So please do share your thoughts on that. So for the final part of the webinar today, I'm going to talk particularly about maths. Often when we're thinking about accessibility, people think about text. They don't think about maths notation. And actually reading aloud maths notation assists sighted readers who want to use text-to-speech as well, because often they may not understand exactly what that notation means. They may be misreading or inaccurately reading a symbol, and they may want the reassurance that it can be read aloud. And when we've talked about making assessments accessible, people always say, well, what about the maths? What about all the symbols? And there are lots of accessibility issues related to reading aloud maths, but we're making progress. It's no longer a brick wall, it's a bit of a hurdle we have to jump over. Most electronics maths is represented as images. Alt tags can be used to describe notation, but that's often using LaTeX or ASCII maths. Apologies for the error there. But PDFs and Flash materials, which is what the core of e-assessment is being used in schools and colleges, still provide significant barriers to accessibility. SVG type images do provide some advantages in that you can resize equations so that they can be zoomed in for those who need content to be larger, but they don't provide any information for speech rendering. So one of the core problems has been, how do we actually publish maths in an accessible way within any type of learning materials, but in particular in an assessment where you want to ensure that it's being read correctly. But before we even get to accessible maths, we also have some barriers to do, particularly to do with the speech rendering of maths. So first of all, I'm sure many of you understand text-to-speech. What it does, it reads aloud the letters on the screen. But when we come to maths, there's no direct phonetic information from that symbol. So we need to have reading rules that connect the symbol on the screen to the text that the voices will read aloud. So there where we have A is greater than or equal to 2, we need to tell the computer, the voice, to read it as that symbol. Second difficulty is that maths is two-dimensional notation, and the location of a symbol affects its meaning and how it should be spoken. So I have an example there from a GCSE maths paper, which was circle the expression that is equivalent to 4 multiplied by x. The 4 options there, if you put it into a normal text-to-speech reader, would be read as x4, 4x, 4x, 4 times x, x times x times x. So you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between 2 of those options just from the speech, and it's not actually giving you all the information. There are also variations in how maths is spoken, and that can depend on context. It can depend on the cultural background of where the maths is being spoken and the mathematical knowledge of the reader. So there's 2 examples on the screen. One could be read as x to the power of 3, x superscript 3, or x cubed. The second example could be read as 1 over 4, a quarter, or fraction 1 over 4. And when we talk to teachers, you'll often find they'll use this colloquial representation, say a quarter, a fifth, a tenth, or x cubed. Within an assessment environment, that might be seen as giving too much information if it's being read in that colloquial fashion. So the final barrier with reading aloud maths is actually reading the maths without ambiguity. When you talk maths, we don't say all the symbols that are on the page. So for this example here, a plus b over 2, it's written on the screen 2 ways. If I said it, you might be able to understand which I'm saying. I could say a plus b over 2, or a plus b over 2. I'm not giving you an indication of where the fraction is lying. A clearer alternative would be, for the first example, a plus open fraction b over 2 closed fraction. For the second example, open fraction, open brackets, a plus b, close brackets, over to closed fraction. That's a huge amount of verbal information for a candidate to understand, and that can put an unfair load onto the candidates of trying to understand what the text is that's being read to them. So we do have this difficulty, and we're not there yet with solving how to read maths correctly. We do have a technical solution though. There is a markup called MathML, which is part of the HTML5 and EPUB 3 standards, so it will be part of the work Alistair was talking about earlier. And that provides assistive technology with the Unicode equivalents to symbols, so we can then connect it to reading rules to say how the maths should be read aloud. And it also provides us with the semantic structure of the notation, so we can start to differentiate between the two examples, such as here, because we know the semantic structure. There is currently limited support for MathML in browsers and in PDFs, but we do have a new technology in the last few years called MathJax, which provides a JavaScript display engine for mathematics. So it enables MathML to be rendered within browsers that don't natively support MathML, and it can also produce the text required for text-to-speech engine and assistive technology tools. We are working on assistive tools as well to be able to read mathematics to remove some of those barriers in terms of ambiguity, and there's a link there for a tool that's been developed at the University of Southampton with the support of BIS and the Technology Strategy Board, which allows candidates to navigate within an equation and have parts of the equation read aloud. And it also allows candidates to choose different reading rules, so we can choose a set of reading rules for maths which are appropriate to the situation and the assessment in particular. But how do we implement this within an assessment situation? So we need to consider those speech rendering considerations. If we go back to that example we had before, circle the expression that is equivalent to 4 times x. We need to ensure that if it is being read aloud, it is not providing too much information to the candidate. So we can't have the second choice there being read as 4 times x. It needs to be appropriate to the candidate. But also the assessment writers should be ensuring that they are writing the questions with speech in mind, so that they are considering how it would be audio rendered. So for there, write the notation to represent 4 multiplied by x wouldn't produce the issue of giving away too much information if it was then read aloud by somebody using text-to-speech or screen reader. But the final big barrier we still have in the UK is actually using accessible formats. In the UK, for high-stakes assessment, we're still very much focused on using either PDF, or for those using online assessments, most of those are using Flash technology, which is a huge range of accessibility barriers. Assessment authoring does not consider the impact of speech rendering and accessibility. Instead, we go through this post-authoring process of modification, either to actually alter the content of the equations or to add in alt tags and reading rules to ensure that it can be read by a text-to-speech reader. And unfortunately, the government and political focus is still very much on a traditional paper-based system for schools and colleges, and the adoption of HTML5 and EPUB 3 within the schools environment at least will still be very limited, although hopefully outside of that regulated community we may see that accessible e-assessments through those technologies coming along quicker. And that was my final slide for this morning. So just going to put up the final slide we had from the 3 of us, which was some links to further information and accessible assessments. Hopefully that will point you to some of the materials that we've been talking about this morning. And I think we have a few minutes left for questions, but I know Alistair's had to rush off to give a workshop this morning. Okay, I'm just
So I was just copying and pasting the links from the slides into the text chat so that people can click on those as live links. Folks, if you would like to ask a question via the microphone, you're welcome to. Just raise your virtual hand using the hands up button. Or type it into the text chat, as you please. We see some little text symbols coming up there, so hopefully people are typing in questions, are they? Ali, perhaps you can comment on the text-to-voice reader kind of landscape?
Yeah, I'm just scanning back through. Okay, so one of the things I've been talking about, particularly in terms of text-to-speech, is reading questions off the screen for sighted readers. Where we have non-sighted readers in the high-stakes exam arrangements, we do modify the papers so they are rewritten by a VI specialist so that the context is suitable for those candidates. I can see there was a question about the OU work on producing alt text automatically from text. That's really useful, and in terms of the A plus B over 2 example, it's just how it would be read aloud in terms of the brackets and whether the reading rules were appropriate to the candidate. So if the original LaTeX had the brackets in the right place, it would be read aloud correctly, and it would also pick up that it was a fraction.
Kevin, would you like to ask a question via the microphone? We notice you have your virtual hand up. If you'd like to press the talk button up in the top left-hand corner.
Good. I'd just like to thank everybody for this. It's been quite a fascinating session. Education's not my sort of main focus. I'm more in the accessibility world, but sort of fascinated by the ideas of. I certainly didn't realise how many. What your proportion was for sort of sighted readers that needed adapted text. Just wanted to say thank you. And my other question I put through, I've got the words of it now. But yeah, it was just really, I was intrigued to know how accessible this blackboard is. It's the first time I've used it, and even as a sighted person, it's phenomenally buttons everywhere and quite difficult to use. Just seems ironic to have such a complicated system to talk about accessibility. Yeah.
I would have to agree. I think a few people have had some trouble getting in this morning, a lot more than average. I had a couple of emails from people with error message box popped up, and it had no words in it. It just had an exclamation mark in the middle of the box. So I don't think whoever wrote the software did any thought about even communicating to people who can read normally.
I'd just like to add that often when we talk to software publishers about their accessibility in terms of learning tools, they will only consider the requirements of screen readers. So it might be keyboard accessible, you can tab around, and a screen reader would pick up the text and read it. That doesn't help those who aren't using screen reader technology, and the majority of people who have visual impairments have some sight and may use a more simpler technology, text-to-speech or increasing the font size, and often their needs aren't supported. So it's always good to ask software publishers what their accessibility demands are, what they can achieve, and what they've tested with. And if they just say JAWS and NVDA, ask further questions, because that won't help the majority of assistive technology users.
There were some comments in the chat there about working out. Tim was working out how to actually make the voice reader software produce the correct kind of text. So as Abby was suggesting before, it probably requires some custom formatting of the text before it's fed into the system. Yeah.
Yeah, just picking up on the numbers. I remember we did a project looking at the numbers of students with additional support needs or special educational needs in Scotland a few years ago. And the official figures were, I think there were 500 individuals identified with a visual impairment only, and that was out of a total number of 35,000 individuals who had some kind of special educational need. And again, by far the biggest number are people with dyslexia or reading difficulties or learning difficulties, mild and moderate learning difficulties. And so it does. If you were, we obviously want everything to be accessible to everybody, but sometimes I think the discussion is focused and biased a bit too heavily towards the needs of making sure that a resource is available and accessible to someone that uses a screen reader. And I work quite a lot with individuals with physical disabilities, cerebral palsy and other muscular dystrophy, MND, and I do quite often get a bit irritated because the needs of these candidates quite often just are ignored. So I think both for the numbers side of it and also just basic equality, accessible does not equal I can use it with a screen reader.
I've seen there's been a bit of discussion about the difference between text-to-speech and screen reader. I'd just like to add that screen readers tend to be used, everything is read out. You assume the user doesn't have any visual clues to where they are navigating on the screen. Text-to-speech is user-initiated, so they will either point to some text and hear it, or they'll select some text and hear it. So they choose what they are going to read and when they are going to read it. They may decide to have a web page or a document read in full, but it is user controlled. They're not navigating by audio. Somebody asked about how text readers cope with foreign language notation, accents and umlauts. As long as you have the right voice loaded up, so that you are using a voice that understands those types of notations, and that notation is part of the text encoding, so the right characters are being used, text-to-speech engines will cope with it. It's when those accents are being represented by an image, they won't be passed to the text-to-speech engine.
Folks, just before you leave, if you could fill in the feedback survey, that would be great. The link in the text chat there, or the link on the slide this time is actually live because I manually inserted it. So thank you. If there's any more questions just in the last couple of minutes, because we'll shut down the session recording very shortly. Okay, looks like people are just typing in thank you. So thank you to our speakers for today, Abby and Paul, and I think Alistair has already left. He had to go to a workshop. So thank you once again. It was very interesting. There's a lot of detail, I think, under there. I also recall from my days of web development teaching, I was always pushing the web content accessibility guidelines towards students as a reasonable starting point. And that was back in the late 90s. So the ideas have been around, and I think they also help. You know, the dollar invested in usability and accessibility, I think, is lots of dollars saved down the track. So thank you all, and see you again next month for our next session for Transforming Assessment.